Welcome to another video presentation by Semitic Roots. This video will be the first part in a multi-part series of videos on the Old Arabic alphabet, commonly known in the literature as Ancient North Arabian. This alphabet forms a sub-branch of the Arabian branch of the Sinaitic derived alphabets and consists of multiple varieties, as you can see here in the tree. Most of the information you can find about Proto-Sinaitic and its early derivatives is focused around the Canaanite branch and around biblical narratives of how the alphabet came into existence, completely ignoring the Arabian branch. Even the literature discussing the development of the alphabet all consider the Arabian alphabets to be secondary developments from the Canaanite branch. But the Arabian alphabets exhibit some of the most archaic letter forms and seem to have a lineage that goes back to the very dawn of the alphabet's development, precluding them being mere developments of Canaanite. The ancient North Arabian inscriptions are distributed throughout the Middle East, but are primarily concentrated in southern Syria, Jordan, and the northwest of Saudi Arabia, actually quite close to Sinai from where the alphabet originated. Today we'll be looking at the variety known as Dadanitic. Dadanitic was used in the kingdom of Dadan in northwest Arabia, around the oasis town that is today known as Al-Ula, throughout the first millennium BC. It's the most polished variety of ancient North Arabian script, and it's thought that a scribal school existed in the capital of Dadan that promulgated the development and style of the script during its lifetime. Unlike the other scripts that we'll be covering that were carved by nomads, Dadanitic was primarily used in official inscriptions and to record the act of religious devotion known as the Zul. And we can see from the beautiful relief inscriptions like this one, just how mature the Dadanitic style is. We'll be going through each letter of the alphabet, comparing it first with its modern Arabic equivalent where applicable, and then to various other sister alphabets and discussing the developments that took place. Unlike the modern Arabic alphabet, the Old Arabic alphabets had 28 distinct letter shapes for the 28 distinct consonants of the Arabic language. As we can see, the groups of letters in red share the same glyph shapes, and just have dots added to disambiguate them. The order we'll be using is the modern Arabic order. So let's get started with Alif. This letter form in modern Arabic consists just of a vertical stroke with the hamza seated on top to represent the glottal stop. But in the Dadanitic form we can see a very different letter shape. Like with all of the Arabian alphabets, the Aleph is very close to the Proto-Sinaitic form of an ox's head with the two upward protruding horns. The shape of the head has opened at the bottom, as with most Arabian letter forms, as we'll see later, and the shape has become more stylized and angular, whilst the eye has disappeared, which happened with all internal features of letter forms in all branches of the alphabet. It's very similar to the Musnad form, although Musnad lost one of the horns. Likewise it's very similar to the Phoenician form, which if we rotate to the same angle looks very similar. And we can see the same in today's modern Latin A, which has been fully rotated so the horns point down. But if we rotate it 180 degrees then we can see a very strong resemblance. Our next letter is Ba. Modern Arabic Ba is a single dot below the line. But again the Dadanitic form is very close to the Proto-Sinaitic form. Just the bottom has opened up, similar to what we saw with Aleph, thought to derive from a diagram of a house, or bait, often with an opening in the bottom corner. We can see the same shape in Musnad, whilst in Phoenician the bottom wall of the house has actually been moved inwards to touch the top wall and the letter has rotated 90 degrees. This developed shape is then further rotated 180 degrees to give us our modern Latin B. Our next letter is Ta. Modern Arabic Ta is represented by two dots above the line. But again the Dadanitic form is nothing like this, but is instead identical to the Proto-Sinaitic form. The orientation of this letter was variable and sometimes appeared diagonal as it is in this font. Musnad again is the same, Phoenician as well. Our modern Latin T is also very similar, all forming the shape of a cross, Our next letter is
th.
Modern Arabic
th.
is 3 dots above the line, and we see a similar parallel in the Dadanitic form, but instead of 3 dots we have 3 lines placed around a circle. This letter shape does not resemble the Proto-Sinaitic or Musnad forms, and Phoenician did not retain this letter. It's quite possible that both Modern Arabic and Dadanitic have independently developed these forms due to a relationship with the number 3, which begins with
th. ثلاثة.
Our next letter is
جيم.
the Dadanitic
جيم.
also doesn't appear to have any parallel in the other Sinaitic-derived scripts. Although it may derive from a Proto-Sinaitic form that uses an outline of the more commonly attested form. The letter shape seems to have become more rounded, though, if that is the case. Our next letter is
ح.
the Dadanitic form of
ح.
is probably derived from the Proto-Sinaitic pictograph that is commonly thought to be a fence. But in Dadanitic the 3 pales of the fence meet together at a single point. This is similar to the Musnad form where they meet together like a trident. The Phoenician form likewise has 3 pales. But by the time it reaches Latin it's reduced to just 1. Our next letter is
خ.
the Dadanitic
خ.
appears to be a reduced form of the Proto-Sinaitic form. If we remove the repeating loops, then we can see that Dadanitic looks just like the bottom portion of the letter form. The Musnad form may match this, but it's not really obvious. And Phoenician lost this letter in the Proto-Canaanite stage. Our next letter is
دال.
the Dadanitic dal has become quite stylized. Compared to Proto-Sinaitic, which was thought to be a door panel hanging from a pole, the panel has become triangular, whilst the pole has become rounded to wrap around the panel. Although variants exist which are more like the Musnad form where the pole is straight. In Phoenician the panel also became triangular and the pole was reduced so that the upper portion disappeared. In our modern Latin form the triangle further became rounded, as is the case with many other letter forms. Our next letter is
ذال.
the Dadanitic
ذال.
seems to just be a variation of the glyph for Zain. The Proto-Sinaitic form was 2 lines, apparently to represent the demonstrative
ذين.
meaning these 2. It bears some similarities to the Musnad form, but not enough to make a clear connection. This letter disappeared before the Phoenician stage of the Canaanite branch. Our next letter is
را.
This is one of the few letter forms that look very similar between the Arabian alphabets and the modern Arabic script. The original Proto-Sinaitic form was the shape of a head. Ras. The Arabian forms appear to have just kept the back arc of the head. Musnad is identical. Phoenician kept the full head but placed it on a stand. The modern Latin version in lower case at least looks more like the arc form. Our next letter is
زين.
the Dadanitic Zain seems to have replaced the diagonal crossbars of the Proto-Sinaitic form with a single straight line from the middle of each side. Musnad retained the Proto-Sinaitic form. Phoenician lost one of the diagonal crossbars. But in some forms it also uses a line like the Dadanitic form. If we rotate it then it looks very similar. Latin Z has the same form as the Phoenician. Our next letter is
سين.
the Dadanitic
سين.
comes from a Proto-Sinaitic letter that was thought to represent a thorny bush. The thorns were lost except for the topmost one. The Musnad form is the same. This letter was lost in Phoenician due to a sibilant merger. Our next letter is
شين.
the Dadanitic shin is the same as Proto-Sinaitic, just differing in orientation. The Musnad form is identical, as is the Phoenician form. The Latin S also derives from this letter shape after one of the arms was lost. Our next letter is
صاد.
the Dadanitic sod resembles the Proto-Sinaitic sod just with the addition of a circle and change in orientation. Musnad is similar just with an elongated stem. Phoenician is also on a stem. Our next letter is
ضد.
the Dadanitic
ضد.
seems to be a square version of a Proto-Sinaitic glyph that could have been used for
ضد.
The Musnad form is similar just with a change in orientation and proportions. This letter was also lost in Phoenician in the Proto-Canaanite stage. Our next letter is
Ta.
The Dadanitic
Ta.
doesn't appear to have any parallel in any other alphabet. Although it is kinda similar to the
Guys.
form, it is probably just coincidental. Our next letter is
Va.
Likewise, there's no obvious similarities to any other script for
Va.
Our next letter is
Ein.
the Dadanitic
Ein.
is like most other alphabets derived from the Proto-Sinaitic pictograph of an eye. In Dadanitic this became a simple circle with the pupil disappearing. Musnad is identical, as is Phoenician. And this letter form gave rise to our letter O in Latin. Our next letter is
Reinen.
the Dadanitic
Reinen.
is identical to Proto-Sinaitic, just opened at the bottom, as is the case with several other letter forms. The Musnad form is identical. This letter was lost from Phoenician in the Proto-Canaanite stage. Our next letter is
Fe.
At first glance this letter form doesn't appear too similar to the Proto-Sinaitic form, which is supposed to be a mouth. And the Musnad form is identical to Proto-Sinaitic, just stylized into more of a diamond shape. But if we look at the Proto-Canaanite form, we can see a very obvious parallel. These forms seem to have retained just one half of the ellipse. In Phoenician the top began to curl around. And then in Latin it completely meets the stem of the letter form, giving us our modern Latin P. Our next letter is
Qaf.
the Dadanitic,
Qaf.
like some Proto-Sinaitic forms, has a slightly off-center top stem. Although straight variants also exist for both. The Musnad form is identical to the straight variants. In Phoenician the stem began to move inside the circle. And our modern Latin Q is based on this. Our next letter is
Kef.
the Dadanitic kaf is an inverted form of the Proto-Sinaitic kaf, which seems to be the shape of a hand. The Musnad form is identical. Only the outside fingers remain. The Proto-Sinaitic form is attested with varying numbers of fingers. Phoenician likewise only has 2 fingers remaining unless we take the top of the stem as the third finger. The Latin K is then based on this form. Our next letter is
Lem.
the Dadanitic lam is identical to the Proto-Sinaitic form, just with less of a hook shape. The Musnad is also very similar, although it's been angled, as has the Phoenician, as well as being inverted. In our modern Latin rendition it has become a 90-degree angle. Our next letter is
Mim.
the Dadanitic meme does not appear to be related to any other scripts. Although it could possibly be related to the Musnad form, but it's not overly obvious. Our next letter is
Nun.
the Dadanitic nun is very close to the Proto-Sinaitic form. Perhaps more so than any other script. The Musnad form is more angled and upright. The Phoenician form is also very similar, whilst our modern Latin version is a lot more folded together. Our next letter is
He.
the Dadanitic he bears some similarity to the Proto-Sinaitic form, albeit in a bent-over form. Some attestations do appear like this, showing the figure dancing or engaged in some kind of ritual. In Musnad we see the 2 hands of the figure clearly pointing up, whilst the Phoenician form seems closest to the Dadanitic with the same kind of bent-over shape. If we remove one of the strokes from the Phoenician form, then it is quite similar. Although the Latin lowercase h is said to derive from the same letter as the uppercase h, it appears more like this letter form, especially if we invert the orientation. Our next letter is
Well.
the Dadanitic war does not look the same as the Proto-Sinaitic war, instead the year resembles the supposed Proto-Sinaitic war. Although this letter shape could perhaps be a case of the stem being moved inside the circle. The Musnad form is identical. Phoenician began to lose the top of the circle. This letter form gave rise to the Latin Y instead of W, and that raises the question of whether this letter form was actually Y or W in Proto-Sinaitic. Our next letter is
Yeah.
This is the Dadanitic letter that better resembles the Proto-Sinaitic letter that is usually linked to or. Although an open-ended circle could look the same as the Proto-Sinaitic form as well. The Musnad form is identical. The Phoenician form has the open end and bent unlike Proto-Sinaitic. So that wraps up this first part of the Old Arabic alphabet series. Next we will be looking at the Safaitic alphabet, the main alphabet used for Old Arabic inscriptions.